A Stage 3 project truck would not be complete without a lift kit, so our friends at Zone Off-Road Products hooked it up with their 6-inch kit for our 2012 FX4 project truck. To start disassembly on the front end, remove the front wheels and the splash guard underneath the truck. Now the front braking system can be disassembled. Unbolt the calipers and securely tie them out of the way so there is no stress on the brake lines. Then the rotor can slip right off and be set aside. Using pliers, remove the dust cover on the front axle and remove the nut holding it to the spindle. Now starting on the front suspension, we remove the sway bar from the sway bar stem mounts and the frame mounts. The removal of the front spindle only requires removing 2 bolts, one on top and one on the bottom. Then the whole front spindle assembly can be lifted out. Next we remove the CV shaft to make it easier to drop the front differential. For removal of the front strut assembly, we remove the bottom bolt on the strut, then the 2 bolts that hold the lower control arm in place. Once all 3 bolts are out, the lower control arm can be dropped out. Lastly, for the front strut, unbolt the top nuts on the strut and drop the strut assembly from the vehicle. Next up, the front drive shaft bolts can be undone and the front drive shaft can be left hanging for the meantime. After the drive shaft, unbolt the 4 bolts that hold the rear crossmember in place. Now moving on to the front differential removal, it can be unbolted from its mounts and lowered from the truck. Now that everything is disassembled, transfer everything from the stock knuckles over to Zone's lifted knuckles. According to Zone's instructions, mark the stock subframe for the necessary cuts to be made. Zone's instructions require you to pull apart the factory spring and strut assembly and transfer the factory spring over to Zone's strut. Unfortunately, due to the fact that the Rancho quick lifts that we have on our truck used a softer spring, we had to source a Ford OEM spring for this install. We then drilled the extra hole in order to mount the new drop brackets. Once the new differential drop brackets are installed on the differential, it can be raised back into the truck. Moving on, the new rear crossmember can be lifted up and installed. Then the sway bar drop brackets can be installed and everything tightened down. After the rear crossmember, move on to installing the front crossmember. We then installed the differential skid plate and bolted it down to the front and rear crossmembers. We now reinstall the lower control arms to the new crossmembers, then the front CV axle. Then the newly assembled front struts can be installed to the top of the strut tower and in the lower control arm. Once the strut is secured, we then replace the newly assembled knuckle. Also, we tightened the nut that holds the CV axle to the spindle. Next to install in the front end is the front brake line drop bracket. Then the rest of the braking system can be installed, including the rotor and caliper. Finishing up the front end, tighten all of the bolts to spec, and also reinstall the front drive shaft and sway bar. Now that our front end is complete, we moved on to the rear. To start, pull down on the e-brake cable until there is a good bit of slack. Then set a pair of lockjaw pliers onto the cable frame mounts to keep it loose. Then move on to the mounting bracket and install Zone's drop bracket in its place. Once the brake cables were squared away, we removed the rear shocks, followed by unbolting the rear U-bolts. Once the U-bolts are out, remove the stock block assembly. Zone's lift kit comes with a new U-bolt perch and block mount for the springs, which requires both stock components to be removed. We started the process by using C-clamps to hold the leaf pack together to prevent it from shifting. Once the stock studs, perches, and mounts were removed from the leaf pack, we installed Zone's hardware and bolted it all down, followed by the install of the new larger block. Now that the block is installed, we moved on to installing the new Zone rear shocks. Last but not least, we put our new wheels and tires on and finished our lift install.